my challenge today, it's a pretty big challenge, is to discuss the constructs of neurointelligence. So what part of our brain or what systems of our brain make somebody more intelligent? So the question that you all should be asking me is, what made you interested in this? Why would you want to talk on this? So the first thing that I want to show you is what I thought about performance optimization last year, and many of you have seen this video. So this is my evolution this past year. So watching that video probably 100 times, I kept reading it and I said, it says push the limits, push your potential, do something that's impossible. So when my conversation or my topic came up for this year's presentation, I was going to talk about athletic performance in functional neurology, but then I said, well, let's push the limits. What if we can not only improve people's physical state, but what about their cognitive state? Now, that's something that's really, really tricky, because if you dig through the literature, everybody says that nothing in the world can change your intelligence permanently. Okay, and the thing is that when you start looking at that and we start looking at the brain, there's a quote that I love and says, if our brains were simple enough to understand, we would be so simple that we couldn't. Right? So what we have to try to do is you try to take this complex structure that sits inside of our head and try to understand it, and then understand how it understands the world. Do you see the challenge there? We have to go multiple levels to understand intelligence. So why should we study intelligence? So when you see, for some of you who out there who don't do a lot of statistical analysis or read a lot of research, what you see is an R. You'll see a lot of R's throughout this presentation. What R is, it's a correlation coefficient. So the higher the number R is, closer to 1, the higher the correlation is. This number could be positive or negative. So if you see a negative R, that means it's inversely correlated. If you see a positive R, that means it's correlated in a positive fashion. So intelligence itself, over a 5-year period, has an R value of 8.8. So almost 100% correlation or 80% correlation with the 5-year academic achievement in students. It also predicts occupational success, social mobility, and job performance. Intelligence also has a strong correlation with income, when you can control education, occupation, and socioeconomic background. So independent of those, that intelligence has a strong correlation with your success in life. People with higher intelligence in childhood usually do not die younger. So the more intelligent you are, there's a correlation with you living longer. 1 million men followed for 20 years that showed a 1 standard deviation in general intelligence increase had a 32% reduction in mortality. So being smarter makes you healthier, live longer, have more income, more success in life, better work performance. So to me, when I started looking at the constructs of neural intelligence in correlation with the theme of this year's conference, I figured it was a no-brainer, no pun intended, that we need to look at intelligence. So the bottom fact you see there, intelligence remains relatively stable over a lifetime. That's not a good thing for us, right? We want to see that there's some variability in intelligence. There's a possibility to change it, so that gives us an opportunity to work with intelligence. But you see, the R value there is 0.73, so a very high correlation that this does not change throughout your life. But however, increasing intelligence may be a key factor for human performance based upon what we talked about. But in order to optimize intelligence, we must understand it first. So what is intelligence? Intelligence itself is the ability, I'm going to read it from the screen, the ability to model the environment and adjust one's physiology and genetic expression to ensure self-preservation. Great definition. However, if you look at that definition, a flower fits that definition. right? A flower, if it's raining out or if it's sunny or if it's cold, the flower can actually change its physiology to adapt to its environment. So we need to expand upon that a little bit more. And what we need to look at is that intelligence is actually a very general capability that, among other things, involves the ability to reason, plan, solve problems, think abstractly, comprehend complex ideas, learn quickly, and learn from experience. That last thing is super important, to learn from experience. It's not merely book learning, but rather our ability to comprehend our surroundings. I'm going to pause there for a second because surroundings are really important. This means there's an environmental factor to intelligence that we have to consider. Catching on, making sense of things, figuring out what to do. That is what intelligence is. So let's kind of talk a little bit more in a more general definition. What is intelligence? It's a measurement of the ability to take the uncertainty, you heard a little bit about uncertainty with Dr. Thatcher this morning, the uncertainty of the environment, and calculate an interaction that promotes survivability and evolution. There's a couple of different types of intelligence. You see there's like a funnel there. So when you look at the red domain of the intelligence, we're going to look at all of the things that start to make up intelligence. And the first thing that make up intelligence are aptitudes, such as things like cognitive traits and different components of thinking. Then we have group factors, so that these aptitudes consolidate into group factors. Some of these different group factors are basically domains of aptitudes. So when you cluster the aptitudes, they fit into one box, and those are the domains of intelligence. We also have emotional intelligence. So emotional intelligence is thought to be aptitude plus your personality. That gives you your emotional intelligence. You also have practical intelligence, which a lot of us know are commonly as street smarts, right? And that's thought to be aptitude plus experience. So your experience plus your aptitudes gives you street smarts. Then there's also general intelligence, or the general factor, we'll call it this week, and everybody in the psychological literature is calling this the G factor, right? So the G factor, this is going to be the buzzword that we're going to be talking about for the next 20 or 30 minutes or so. So G factor is a factor derived from all aptitudes that culminate into what people call smartness, okay? Your ability to be smart. So when you think of intelligence, you probably think of the three domains you see on the screen there: communication, memory, and reasoning. So when you start thinking about like Einstein or Tesla or Sir Isaac Newton, all of these individuals, you start thinking, wow, what a smart guy. He's got intelligence, he can remember things, he has this superior capability to reason. But many things that people don't really include into intelligence is this ability to process quickly, and also spatial awareness. Spatial awareness, that's huge when it comes to intelligence. All of these things together come together to make what we call G, right? This general intelligence. So where did this term, this general intelligence, come from? Well, it came from a gentleman back in like 1904, Charles Spearman. He's kind of the father of rank correlation. So it's a statistical analysis where you can see if something's correlated. So he started doing factor analysis with different types of tests. And the reason why he started doing this is he observed that children in school tend to have the same grades in all of their subjects, even though those subjects are very different, such as social studies versus science, or reading versus math. They're very, very different types of aptitudes, but their grades tended to correlate across the board. So G is a factorial based upon correlations observed from more than over 80 different types of narrow cognitive abilities. So we talked a little bit about this R value, -1 to +1. So when we start seeing some of these numbers that pop up, 0 to 0.3 is considered a weak correlation. 0.3 to 0.5 is a moderate correlation. 0.5 to 0.7 is a strong correlation. And 0.7 to 0.1 is pretty much considered a perfect correlation, obviously with 1.0 rather, being the perfect correlation. So what is this G factor? If you took a look at G factor and you looked at it and compared it to the universe, if all intelligence was the universe in which we exist, aptitudes would be the stars, domains would be, or group factors would be the galaxies, and G would be everything that's not those things. Oh boy, right? It's got to twist your mind a little bit, right? It's the space that exists inside the universe that we know is there, and we know how important it is, but we can't measure it, we can't feel it, we can't do anything but know that it exists. That is what this value or this G factor is. We can only deduce what G is. So the G factor is not a number, it's not a score, it's a measurement. It's a statistic extrapolated from intelligent domain tests that basically attempts to measure the immeasurable. Okay, so Spearman realized there's something there that links these different aptitudes together, but we can't understand or figure out what it is. So it predicts educational, occupational, all the things that we talked about before, and there's some references there. And it has the highest adult heritability of any psychological trait. So we say this is partially or largely genetic. So that screen, half that screen is blurred out for a reason, because when you put this whole thing up there, it becomes a big, kind of a hard thing to understand. But in the center there, we have G, and there you see G sub C, right? When we start looking at the different types of general intelligence or G factor, there's two types. And the first type we're going to talk about is crystallized G factor, or crystallized intelligence. Crystallized intelligence comes from your education, from your culture, from the words that you speak and that you're taught. And we know the parts of the brain that are associated with this G sub C, or crystallized intelligence. We've got our ventrolateral prefrontal cortices, we've got our temporal lobes, our hippocampus, and what many people correlate call our ventral processing stream. Our ventral processing stream. So you see vocabulary and memory there. And really importantly, below that, what you're going to see is this type of crystallized intelligence is basically considered top-down processing. Top-down processing or above-down processing. It's cognitive-based types of processing. When we look at the rest of the picture, we have another component of G, and this is your fluid intelligence. Now, you see a nice little round swinging arrow there. Is what that means is you have to have fluid intelligence in order to crystallize your intelligence. And actually, it came first evolutionarily. So this G sub F, or this fluid intelligence, is pattern recognition, abstract reasoning, problem solving. Basically, you could think of anything that existed when we were cavemen is fluid intelligence. This exists more in our dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, our parietal lobe, our anterior cingulate, and also what we consider our dorsal stream. And these types of things are bottom-up processing, or we call them receptor-based sort of different concomitants. So we have our spatial ability, our processing speed, and you see reasoning is a hybrid of both. So we need to know where we are in space. We need to be identified patterns in order for us to be able to process them, to reason them, to remember them, and then to communicate them. So you can see if you look at this screen from right to left, this is pretty much the evolutionary development of intelligence. First starting with the ability to know where you are in space and where space is in relationship to you, then to be able to process and interact with that, and then reason, should I interact with this a certain way or should I not? Then remember that for future reference, and then to communicate it to others so your community or your culture survives. So this is what we look at when we're really looking at general intelligence. It's all of this come together, and you start to see some of those R values there. There's some things that really, really highly correlate, almost a perfect correlation with general intelligence, and that's reasoning and spatial ability. So that suggests to us that knowing where you are in space and where space is in relationship to you is probably the most important component of intelligence. Does anybody in the room work with that on a daily basis? Every one of us, right? That is what functional neurologists, this is our bread and butter. This is what we do every single day, help people perceive themselves and where they are in their environment so that they can appropriately interact with our environment. And the things that we do, according to some factor analysis, has a 0.91 or almost a perfect correlation to intelligence. So what? What does this mean? So high IQ, we'll call it, or high G, so IQ and G are pretty much synonymous even though they're different things. So high G individuals are better at solving problems than less individual intelligence only if the problems are evolutionarily novel. So what does that mean, evolutionarily novel? Take a look around the room. Whatever exists in this room that didn't exist back when humans were first kind of coming around and cavemen is evolutionarily novel. So if you look around, there's only a couple things. Men, women, well, there's no boys and children here, but basically men and women. People. So things that are evolutionarily novel: mating, parenting, lie detection, fear avoidance. and food seeking. Those are the things that are not evolutionarily novel. So if you look at individuals that are high G individuals or low G individuals, they both do the same in evolutionarily old topics, but the evolutionarily new topics, only high G individuals perform well in those areas. So therefore, G factor is evolutionarily important for survivability and prosperity. Evolutionary problems. So this was a great quote that I saw. Larry King, what professor puzzles you the most and what do you think about most? Stephen Hawking, women. Right? So that just shows you somebody that has a very, very high G brain has a difficulty processing something that's evolutionarily old. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the anatomy of G. So these are the anatomical structures and functional connectivity associated with G, because if we can understand where in the brain and what networks are associated with this intelligence, then we might be able to do something about it. So the question is, how do you measure and locate the intangible? Well, we have to do this through factor analysis. We're not going to go into factor analysis. We're not going to perform factor analysis. People do that work for us. What we need to do is use their work and put it into clinical practice. So through factor analysis, we can identify tasks that are both high G loaded and low G loaded, okay? We localize G factor through fMRI and QEEG, and we also administer assessments that are typically high G loaded, and we watch to see what happens with individuals' brains. So the structures that we start to look at when we look at the gray matter associated with intelligence, there's a number of different structures. And instead of going through this whole thing and really talking about the different structures, there's a really important flow that comes here. What you don't see lit up are your primary sensory cortices involved with G, right? You don't see your primary sensory cortices. For example, you look at your occipital lobe, the occipital pole, you don't see anything lit up in the occipital pole because perception of the environment, bringing the environment in, isn't associated necessarily with G. That's evolutionarily old, right? Just to be able to see, to be able to hear, to be able to smell. But what you start to see is the association cortices are more involved with things like G. So you've got your occipital, temporal, and parietal association areas. We start looking at the angular gyrus in here. So the angular gyrus, this is awareness of yourself, memory retrieval, spatial orientation, math, abstract thought, and language. That's all the stuff that happens in that angular gyrus. We've got 39 and 40 right over here, the supramarginal gyrus. This is multimodal sensory integration. Multimodal sensory integration happens right there in that supramarginal gyrus. The superior parietal lobule, this is for manipulation and arrangement of thought and working memory. We've got the posterior parietal cortex. The posterior parietal cortex, which is super important. This is area 40 of your parietal lobe. And this is localization of your body and objects in space, reasoning, calculation, all of these different types of things like choice and decision making, and it's even thought that free will is found in this posterior parietal cortex. And interestingly enough, when they were able to examine Einstein's brain and they start doing comparative analysis of Einstein's brain versus normal people's brains, really the only thing that they found is that Einstein had this massive left-sided posterior parietal cortex, which makes sense. This guy was a master of manipulating thought and master of manipulating spatial orientation and things that might have been even abstract. We also have our dorsal and ventral lateral prefrontal cortices. The anterior cingulate. The anterior cingulate is probably one of the most important areas of our brain when it comes to interacting with the world and intelligence. The reason why is that your anterior cingulate is very important for hypothesis calculation and more so the fear of being wrong. Now, the fear of being wrong isn't just a social thing. That maybe when you start looking at more contemporary aspects, the fear of being wrong may seem more social. But if you were a caveman, the fear of being wrong meant what? You're eaten by a saber-toothed tiger, right? So this is a very important part of our brain and very important in this intelligence. So therefore, it's our filter. It's part of our filter system so that we don't say wrong things. And if you don't say wrong things, sometimes you sound smarter, right? The other thing that's really important is we look at Broca's, and as we talked about a little bit yesterday, this pars triangularis and premotor areas. So our ability to communicate, whether it's with our body language or our verbal language. These are all of the areas, the gray matter structures that are involved with intelligence. What about the white matter? So studies of brain injury patients reveal that damage to white matter tracts in the frontal polar areas were associated with a significant decrease in G. Therefore, G draws on connections between visual, spatial, memory, verbal, and executive processes. Another thing that's really important is interconnectivity. So brain waves correlate strongly with IQ. So 0.5 to 0.7 correlation. Interestingly, and this was a study that was done by Dr. Thatcher, interestingly, higher IQ is related to increased efficiency in local information processing rather than long information or long distance dynamics. So what does this mean? That our brain is, if we're intelligent, has better ability to efficiently process in our local networks and also efficiently process over long networks. What we see is low G individuals have more activity in different areas of the brain, so they're less efficient. Therefore, cognitive efficiency is a really important thing to look at when you're looking at intelligence. So measuring G factor. It's not easy. It's not easy at all. So what you see here, these are the domains that we talked about, the major domains, and we're going to repeat these again because they're so important. Spatial ability, we've got processing speed, we've got reasoning, memory, and vocabulary. And I say them in that order because we've got to try to remember how they evolutionarily exist, because if we understand how they evolutionarily developed, then when they don't work, we can start looking at an evolutionary perspective of rehabilitation. And what we see, there's multiple different factors, and this was done in two studies, one by Deere and one from Salthouse, back about 5 or 10 years ago. And what they found is there's different, the important part of this is you see the test 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 across the bottom. They all integrate into a domain, but with different degrees of correlation. So individual tests correlate to the domains differently, and domains correlate to G in a different fashion. So unless you're a neuropsychologist and you have hours and hours to work on these types of things and you can administer hours and hours worth of tests, in a clinical practice, we have to start looking at the domains and assessing the domains. So some of my thoughts on intelligence and basically how does this relate to your patients. So IQ equals evolution, therefore evolution equals IQ. So intelligence develops an evolutionary sequence. We talked about this: spatial, orientation, processing, reasoning, memory, communication. So the question is how does this affect our patients? So developmental delays or injuries affecting any of the above, any of those things listed above there, can change and stunt intelligence. Another thing is that intelligence is highly heritable. So you can inherit these from your parents, but so is hair color. And the reason why I have this here is because I had this nice brown hair until I met Dr. Carrick. Now I've got all these gray streaks. So therefore, if my parents have brown hair and black hair, how do I end up with gray hair? So the question is, can genetic expression change from the environment? So I think so. I think that different environmental factors can actually change your genetic expression. Therefore, maybe if we can manipulate environmental factors, we can change people's intelligence expression. So unraveling this G factor. We said that spatial correlation is a 0.91 correlation to this G. We also know that reasoning has a really high correlation with this G, of 0.97. So we should ask, what contributes to spatial orientation and what contributes to reasoning? Vestibular input is one of the main sensory systems related to physical and cognitive spatial awareness. If you guys haven't read this paper, you have to. It's called Vestibular Pathways Involved in Cognition by Martin Hittier in 2014, published in Frontiers of Integrative Neuroscience. It is an amazing, amazing read, and it's super applicable to functional neurology. So the important thing that I want you to see off of this is you get your vestibular structures, all the connections. All the way at the top of the screen, what do you see? Posterior parietal cortex, Einstein's brain. So this vestibular input has the possibility of changing the integrity of this posterior parietal cortex and other very important parts of the brain as well. But as far as intelligence goes, that posterior parietal cortex is very pivotal. So spatial orientation equals the ability to take sensory and motor information and vestibular information and put it together. So the fact that somatosensory and motor are so important, what part of the brain do you know integrates somatosensory information and motor output? It's like the orchestrator of our brain. It's the conductor of the symphony. Our cerebellum, right? Our cerebellum. So virus transneural tracers has demonstrated that the output from the cerebellum reaches vast areas of the neocortex, including regions of the prefrontal and posterior parietal cortex. So these types of joint manipulations, and we do these complex movement activities and complex movement patterns. they have a way of the efferent fibers coming from that cerebellum going into the posterior parietal cortex can increase and optimize genetic expression in that posterior parietal cortex. The other thing is that the cells in our brain, if you look on a cellular level, is designed for multimodal integration. So intelligence is a result of multimodal integration, aka environmental perception. And we see this when we start looking at the association cortex versus the frontal cortex, the prefrontal cortex. What we know is in monkeys, you have 16 times the number of spinous arborizations in the prefrontal cortex than you do in the association and like your vision areas or your smell or your taste areas, your primary sensory association areas. The other thing that we know is that when we look at how those things actually work, the association areas are phasic, they turn on and off, and the prefrontal cortex is tonic. So therefore, that prefrontal cortex is always waiting for that information to come to it so that it can integrate it and create survivability for us. So here's some applications for us. Manipulation of bottom-up or receptor-based variables may have a potential to influence intelligence. Rehabilitation or optimization of intelligence requires a multimodal, intensive implementation of exercises. They're kind of driven towards spatial or sensory integration, processing, reasoning, memory, and communication. Top-down exercises combined with bottom-up stimulation contribute to a heavy synaptogenesis model of intelligence optimization. So really quickly, last couple slides, I want to talk about how do we assess the change in G. So ideally, you'd have to do these Wechsler tests, one for adults, one for children. They have a pretty much almost a perfect correlation with intelligence. The second best option is a Raven's progressive matrices. Now, when you start looking at some of these tests, they all have inherent contamination to them. Raven's progressive matrices is a spatial orientation test. It's about they have a 20-minute version, a 40-minute version, and a 60-minute version of this test. And what it does is, and you see it in the bottom right-hand corner there, it presents you with a couple shapes and asks you what is the next shape that belongs inside that area. And you do this for 20 to 40 or 60 minutes. And this is testing your spatial domain, which we know has a very, very high correlation with G, right? But it's contaminated because it's only assessing the spatial domain. It's not assessing communication, it's not assessing memory, it's not assessing reason, it's not assessing processing. But it has a high correlation of 0.81, that progressive matrices test. How do we do this practically? Assess each of the domains: spatial orientation, processing, reasoning, memory, and communication. Yesterday, I discussed a tool that does that. That's what I use in my practice. That's what we use in our facility. That's what my team uses. We're not getting a clear-cut picture of G, but it's the best that we can do in under 15 minutes so that we can create some practical applications of this. So in the end, we've got to draw a conclusion. The frontal and parietal cortices likely comprise of crucial processing areas for intelligence, but integrity of hard connections across the brain and spontaneous harmonic coactivation among distant regions appear to be relevant. So basically, we have to have focal integrity and long-range integrity in order to have intelligence. And this was a nice quote: creating a comprehensive picture of what we call neurointelligence should prove exciting as it is challenging. But in the research, we know that the trajectories of mental development are not easily deflected. IQ levels tend to remain unchanged from adolescence to onward, and all efforts to change this G factor general intelligence through educational means have failed. So if there is a reliable ethical way to raise or equalize levels of G, no one has found it. That was published in 2017. Nobody has found a way to change G. So to me, this sounds like a thrilling and worthwhile challenge for functional neurology. So those are the neurological constructs of intelligence that we can do in the period of time that we have allotted, but I'm really excited to hopefully offer some of these different programs and moving forward in the future. And hopefully that functional neurology can move from helping individuals that are suffering from ailments such as traumatic brain injuries, also apply it to performance optimization, as we heard a little bit about today, but also cognitive performance, because people that are suffering from cognitive performance difficulties are suffering almost or maybe just the same as somebody that has a physical ailment, and I think functional neurology has the answer for that. Those are some references. If anybody wants the references, I have them all. There's a lot of them, but we're happy to give them out, and I thank you for your time and your attention.